The September afternoon had settled over St. Mary Mead with the gentle contentment of a cat in sunshine. The annual church fete was in full swing on the grounds of Rosemary Cottage, where Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth had graciously opened her gardens for the worthy cause of the church roof fund. Bunting fluttered lazily between the ancient oak trees, and the air carried the mingled scents of roses, fresh-baked scones, and that particular mixture of excitement and respectability that marked such village gatherings. Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably in a wicker chair near the tea tent, her knitting needles clicking in their familiar rhythm as she worked on what appeared to be a baby's blanket in soft yellow wool. To any casual observer, she seemed entirely absorbed in her handiwork, occasionally pausing to untangle a particularly stubborn loop or to admire the intricate pattern emerging under her fingers. But her pale blue eyes, bright and alert behind her wire-rimmed spectacles, missed nothing of the social theater unfolding around her. She had positioned herself with the instinctive wisdom of years, where the shade of the great elm provided comfort, while offering an excellent view of the comings and goings across the lawn. From here, she could observe the cake stall where Mrs. Bantry held court with her prize-winning Victoria sponge, the skittles where young men showed off for giggling girls, and most particularly, the little corner where Mr. Oliver Pratt had set up his antiques appraisal service. Mr. Pratt was a newcomer to the village, having arrived from London only a month prior to take lodgings at the vicarage while he completed some research on local historical artifacts. He was a thin, sharp-featured man in his 40s, with prematurely grey hair and clever hands that seemed to know the worth of things at a touch. Mrs. Ashworth had been quite taken with him, declaring that having a genuine expert examine the village's treasures was exactly the sort of modern touch the fete needed. The hostess herself moved through her guests with practiced grace, resplendent in a dress of deep blue silk that complemented her silver hair. Mrs. Ashworth had been widowed 3 years prior and had moved to St. Mary Mead, seeking, as she often said, the peace of genuine English country life. She had quickly established herself as a force in village society, generous with her time and money, though Miss Marple had noticed she possessed the particular charm of those accustomed to having their own way in all things. Near the coconut shy, Mrs. Ashworth's niece Sarah was engaged in animated conversation with young Timothy Fletcher from the bank. Sarah Pemberton was a lovely girl of 25, with dark hair and intelligent eyes, though there was something restless about her that suggested she found village life rather confining. Timothy, earnest and well-meaning, seemed quite smitten, though Miss Marple observed with the wisdom of long experience that his affections appeared somewhat one-sided. Dr. Geoffrey Hawthorne, the village's bachelor physician, stood near the bookstall in conversation with the vicar, though his attention seemed frequently drawn to Mrs. Ashworth's graceful figure as she moved among her guests. The doctor was a handsome man in his early 50s, with graying temples and the sort of steady, reliable manner that inspired confidence in his patients. Miss Marple had noticed that Mrs. Ashworth's invitations to the doctor had become increasingly frequent of late. The afternoon progressed with the gentle rhythm of such gatherings. Children chased each other between the stalls, their laughter mixing with the more subdued conversations of their elders. Mrs. Dolly Bantry won the flower arrangement competition for the 3rd consecutive year, causing some good-natured grumbling from the other contestants. The vicar's wife accidentally knocked over a display of prize vegetables, leading to much flustered apologizing and helpful reorganizing. It was nearly 4 o'clock when Mrs. Ashworth announced that tea would be served on the terrace, and the crowd began to migrate toward the back of the cottage. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and followed at a leisurely pace, noting how the shadows had lengthened across the carefully maintained garden. The terrace overlooked a charming vista of roses and herbaceous borders, with a small summer house tucked away at the far end. But it was the green-painted rocking chair on the covered portion of the terrace that caught Miss Marple's particular attention. It was an old-fashioned piece with a faded chintz cushion, positioned to catch both the afternoon breeze and an excellent view of the garden. Mrs. Ashworth had mentioned that it had belonged to her late husband, who had spent many peaceful hours there, reading his newspaper and watching the birds. As the guests settled themselves at the small tables arranged with Mrs. Ashworth's best china, Miss Marple noticed that several people had made use of the rocking chair throughout the afternoon. Dr. Hawthorne had sat there briefly while waiting for Mrs. Ashworth to finish arranging the flowers. Sarah had rested there for a few minutes, looking rather pensive. Even Mr. Pratt had occupied it while examining a small silver box that someone had brought for his opinion. The conversation flowed pleasantly enough, touching on the success of the fete, the unusually fine weather, and the recent engagement of the postmaster's daughter. Mrs. Ashworth moved among her guests with practiced ease, though Miss Marple noticed she seemed somewhat distracted, her eyes frequently scanning the assembled company as if looking for someone in particular. It was then that Miss Marple observed something curious. The rocking chair, which had been still for several minutes, suddenly began to move with a gentle, rhythmic motion. There was no breeze to speak of, and certainly no one sitting in it. Yet it rocked back and forth as if an invisible occupant had just risen and given it a final, affectionate push. Miss Marple watched the chair with growing interest, her knitting temporarily forgotten in her lap. Mrs. Ashworth excused herself to fetch more sandwiches from the kitchen, and the minutes stretched on without her return. Dr. Hawthorne, after checking his watch several times, finally rose to look for her, his concern evident despite his attempts to maintain a casual air. The murmur of conversation on the terrace gradually died away as more guests became aware that their hostess had been absent for an unusually long period. The rocking chair continued its mysterious motion, and Miss Marple found herself studying it with the focused attention she usually reserved for a particularly complex knitting pattern. Something was not quite right, though she could not yet put her finger on what it might be. It was Sarah who found her aunt. Her scream, high and sharp with shock, cut through the drowsy afternoon air like a blade, causing teacups to rattle in their saucers and sending several elderly ladies reaching for their smelling salts. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care and rose from her chair, her movements unhurried despite the sudden urgency that had gripped the gathering. The scene in Mrs. Ashworth's sitting room was one that would remain etched in their memories for years to come. The room was elegant and comfortable, with French doors standing open to the garden and the mysterious rocking chair visible just beyond on the terrace. But it was the figure seated in the high-backed chair near the fireplace that commanded everyone's attention. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth sat perfectly upright, her silver hair still immaculately arranged, her hands folded neatly in her lap. At first glance, she might have been merely resting, perhaps having dozed off in the warmth of the afternoon. But her face had already taken on the waxy pallor that Miss Marple recognized all too well, and her eyes stared sightlessly at some point beyond the assembled crowd of horrified guests. Dr. Hawthorne pushed through the gathering and knelt beside the chair, his professional training overriding his personal shock. His examination was brief but thorough, and when he straightened, his face was grim. Mrs. Ashworth was quite dead, though there were no obvious signs of violence or distress. Outside on the terrace, the green rocking chair continued its gentle, inexplicable motion, as if moved by some presence that lingered still in the peaceful afternoon air. Miss Marple remained in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her, knowing that in such moments the most important clues were often the ones that seemed least significant at first glance. The chair that rocked alone had begun to tell its story, and Miss Marple intended to listen very carefully indeed. The silence that followed Dr. Hawthorne's pronouncement seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the gentle ticking of the ormolu clock on the mantelpiece and Sarah's muffled sobs against Timothy Fletcher's shoulder. The assembled guests stood frozen in a tableau of shock and disbelief, as if movement itself might somehow make the terrible reality more concrete. Miss Marple remained positioned near the French doors, her pale blue eyes moving methodically across the scene with the patience of long practice. She noted how Dr. Hawthorne's hands, steady and sure during his examination, now trembled slightly as he straightened his waistcoat. His professional composure was admirable, yet there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested this death had affected him more deeply than a physician's usual encounter with mortality. "We must not disturb anything further," Dr. Hawthorne said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of medical training. "The police will want to see everything exactly as we found it." His gaze swept the room, lingering for a moment on the writing desk where a drawer sat slightly ajar, then moving to the side table beside Mrs. Ashworth's chair. Miss Marple followed his glance to the delicate Derby teacup resting on its saucer. The vermilion lipstick mark on the rim was unmistakably Mrs. Ashworth's shade, yet something about the cup's placement seemed oddly deliberate. There were 2 faint rings on the saucer beneath it, suggesting the cup had been lifted and set down more than once, perhaps by hands that were less than steady. "Poor dear Cordelia," Mrs. Bantry whispered, her usual commanding presence subdued by the gravity of the moment. "She seemed in such good spirits this afternoon. Who could have imagined?" Mr. Oliver Pratt moved slightly closer to the fireplace, his sharp features composed but alert. Miss Marple noticed how his eyes lingered on the mantelpiece, where a pale rectangular outline marked the recent removal of what had likely been a photograph or small frame. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture that suggested more than casual interest in the room's contents. "Mrs. Ashworth mentioned she had some items for your assessment," Miss Marple observed mildly, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "I do hope this tragedy won't interfere with your research, Mr. Pratt." The antiques appraiser's response was carefully measured. "Mrs. Ashworth was most gracious in offering to show me her collection. We had arranged to meet privately after the fete concluded." His pause was almost imperceptible. Of course, such matters seemed quite trivial now. Sarah lifted her tear-stained face from Timothy's shoulder, her dark eyes reflecting a complex mixture of grief and something that might have been guilt. "Aunt Cordelia was so particular about her treasures," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She knew the history of every piece, every photograph. She said they were all she had left of the life she'd shared with Uncle Harold." Through the open French doors, the afternoon breeze had finally stilled completely, yet Miss Marple's attention was drawn once more to the green rocking chair on the terrace. As she watched, a faint glimmer caught the light near the doorframe, thin as spider's silk and gone in an instant. Her experienced eye recognized the telltale sign of fishing line or fine thread, though she gave no outward indication of her observation. The sound of bicycle wheels on gravel announced the arrival of Constable Polk, whose heavy footsteps could soon be heard approaching through the front hall. The vicar, who had been standing in stunned silence near the window, roused himself to meet the officer and explain the situation in hushed, urgent tones. Miss Marple used the momentary distraction to study the faces around her more carefully. Timothy Fletcher's concern for Sarah appeared genuine, yet there was an underlying nervousness in his manner that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances. Dr. Hawthorne continued to hover protectively near Mrs. Ashworth's chair, his professional instincts warring with what appeared to be personal distress. Most intriguing of all was Mr. Pratt's behavior, his careful positioning allowing him to observe both the room's contents and the reactions of everyone present. As Constable Polk entered the sitting room, his rural common sense clearly overwhelmed by the situation, Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of sudden death in small communities. In her experience, such events rarely occurred in isolation, but were more often the culmination of long simmering tensions and carefully hidden secrets. The mysterious motion of the rocking chair, the missing item from the mantelpiece, and the subtle wrongness she sensed in the room's arrangement all suggested that Mrs. Ashworth's peaceful afternoon had been interrupted by something far more sinister than natural causes. The investigation was about to begin in earnest, but Miss Marple suspected the real mystery lay not in what the authorities would discover, but in what the assembled mourners were so carefully trying to conceal. Constable Polk appeared in the doorway with the uncertain air of a man suddenly thrust into waters far deeper than his usual patrol of bicycle lamps and poaching complaints. His ruddy face had taken on a pale cast beneath his helmet, and his notebook, produced with ceremonial gravity, seemed woefully inadequate for the elegant tragedy before him. He cleared his throat twice before managing to speak, his voice carrying the careful formality of someone acutely aware that the assembled company included the doctor, the vicar, and several ladies whose social standing far exceeded his own. "Right then," he began, his pencil hovering uncertainly above the page, "I'll need to take some particulars from each of you. When did anyone last see Mrs. Ashworth alive? And did she appear in good health at the time?" Dr. Hawthorne stepped forward with professional authority, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hands as he straightened his waistcoat. "I spoke with her briefly around 3:30 just before tea was announced. She appeared perfectly well, perhaps a touch excited about the success of the fete, but nothing to suggest any distress." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the teacup on the side table with its defiant vermilion lipstick mark. "Given her age and the excitement of hosting such an event, it's entirely possible this was a natural occurrence. The heart, you understand, can be unpredictable." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm, but her pale blue eyes sharpened at the doctor's eagerness to suggest natural causes. In her long experience, those who were quickest to discourage deeper investigation often had the most compelling reasons to do so. She watched as Dr. Hawthorne's professional composure began to show hairline cracks, his concern appearing to transcend mere medical duty. Sarah wiped her eyes with Timothy's handkerchief, her voice still shaky as she addressed the constable. Aunt Cordelia excused herself to fetch more sandwiches from the kitchen. She said she wanted everything to be perfect for her guests. Fresh tears threatened to overwhelm her. She was so proud of today, so pleased that everyone had come. She particularly wanted to make a good impression on Mr. Pratt. All eyes turned to the antiques appraiser, who maintained his composed demeanor despite the sudden scrutiny. "Mrs. Ashworth was most gracious in her hospitality," he said carefully, his sharp features betraying nothing. "She had mentioned having several pieces she hoped I might examine, items that had belonged to her late husband's family. We had arranged to discuss them privately once the fete concluded." Miss Marple found this information particularly intriguing, especially considering the pale rectangular outline on the mantelpiece where dust had been disturbed in a telling semicircle. Her observant eye had also noted that Mr. Pratt's jacket pocket bulged slightly, as if containing something more substantial than the usual gentleman's accessories. As Constable Polk dutifully recorded these statements, his growing bewilderment evident in the way he kept glancing toward Dr. Hawthorne for guidance, Miss Marple allowed her attention to drift toward the French doors. The green rocking chair sat motionless now in the afternoon light, but her sharp eyes detected something that had escaped everyone else's notice. Caught on the rough bark of the nearby elm tree was a single thread of what appeared to be fine fishing line, so transparent as to be nearly invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. The pause that followed Polk's questioning created a space in which village nature began to assert itself. Mrs. Bantry, never one to remain silent for long, leaned toward Mrs. Price Ridley with the air of someone sharing vital intelligence. Such a tragedy, and so unexpected, though she did seem rather distracted lately, didn't she? All those meetings with London dealers about selling her treasures. Selling? Sarah's voice carried a note of surprise that seemed genuine. Aunt Cordelia mentioned being practical about finances, but I had no idea she was seriously considering parting with Uncle Harold's collection. Mr. Pratt inclined his head with neutrality that was perhaps a shade too polished. Many widows find themselves in similar circumstances. Maintaining a property of this size can be quite costly, and family heirlooms, while sentimentally valuable, often represent significant assets. Mrs. Price Ridley nodded knowingly. "I heard she had words with that Mr. Higgins from the coal yard last week. Something about an unpaid bill. Money troubles can affect people in unexpected ways. Timothy Fletcher, eager to comfort Sarah, murmured, "Perhaps it was simply her time, darling. These things happen, especially at her age." But Sarah pulled away slightly, her dark eyes distant and troubled. Aunt Cordelia was strong as an ox, Timothy. She had so much she wanted to accomplish. Miss Marple listened to this exchange with the patient attention of a naturalist observing bird behavior, noting how quickly people sought comfort in familiar explanations, while inadvertently revealing their own knowledge and concerns. The air in the room felt charged with more than grief, carrying undercurrents of guilt, fear, and carefully guarded secrets. Young Timothy volunteered to bicycle to the police station when Polk mentioned the telephone line was engaged, and his eager departure seemed to provide relief for several of those present. As the constable announced that Inspector Craddock was on his way from much deeping, a fresh wave of murmuring swept through the gathering, mixing fear with the peculiar excitement that accompanies proximity to serious crime. Dr. Hawthorne approached Miss Marple as she stood contemplating the garden through the French doors. "Miss Marple, I hope this tragic business hasn't upset you too greatly. Perhaps I should arrange for someone to see you home." His concern appeared genuine, yet there was something in his manner that suggested he was eager to see the remaining guests depart. Miss Marple smiled with gentle gratitude, while noting how his eyes kept returning to the sitting room where Mrs. Ashworth remained in her peaceful repose. "How thoughtful of you, Doctor, though I confess I find myself quite fascinated by Mrs. Ashworth's garden. Such attention to detail, such careful planning. One can tell a great deal about a person from observing how they arrange their surroundings." Her seemingly innocent observation caused Dr. Hawthorne to stiffen almost imperceptibly, and Miss Marple filed away this reaction with the methodical precision of a librarian cataloguing books. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the formal investigation prepared to begin, Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of sudden death in small communities. The mysterious motion of the rocking chair, the missing photograph, the nearly invisible fishing line, and the subtle wrongness she sensed in the room's arrangement all whispered of something far more complex than natural causes. The village was already providing its own flawed testimony through gossip and speculation, a tapestry of half-truths and assumptions that she would need to carefully unravel. The chair that rocked alone had begun to tell its story, and Miss Marple suspected the most important chapters were yet to be revealed. Inspector Craddock arrived with the sort of quiet efficiency that immediately transformed the atmosphere from village tragedy to serious investigation. He was a man of medium build, with intelligent gray eyes and the weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time pursuing facts across the English countryside. His presence seemed to draw the scattered threads of confusion into something resembling order, and even Constable Polk visibly straightened under his superior's calm authority. The inspector's preliminary survey of the sitting room was methodical without being obvious, his gaze taking in Mrs. Ashworth's peaceful repose, the teacup with its telltale vermilion mark, and the subtle wrongness that Miss Marple had sensed from the beginning. When his eyes briefly met hers near the French doors, she detected a flicker of recognition that suggested her reputation for observation had preceded her to this investigation. "Dr. Hawthorne," Inspector Craddock addressed the physician with professional courtesy, "I'd appreciate your medical assessment of the situation." The doctor stepped forward with renewed confidence, though Miss Marple noted how he still avoided looking directly at Mrs. Ashworth's face. "No obvious signs of trauma, Inspector. Mrs. Ashworth was in her 70s, and the excitement of hosting such an elaborate event could easily have overtaxed her heart. Sudden cardiac failure would be the most logical explanation." He paused, his professional training warring with some inner reluctance. Of course, a proper post-mortem would be necessary for any definitive determination. Inspector Craddock nodded thoughtfully, making careful notes while his attention moved systematically around the room. Miss Marple observed with interest how his gaze lingered on the same details that had caught her notice. The disturbed dust pattern on the mantelpiece, the slightly ajar drawer of the writing desk, and through the French doors, the motionless green rocking chair that had caused such puzzlement earlier. "Miss Pemberton," the inspector turned to Sarah with gentle formality, "you discovered Mrs. Ashworth. Can you describe her state of mind recently? Had she mentioned any concerns or worries?" Sarah's response came haltingly, as if each word required careful consideration. Aunt Cordelia had been somewhat preoccupied lately, though she insisted it was merely the usual concerns of property management. She had been corresponding with London dealers about some of Uncle Harold's collection. Her glance toward Mr. Pratt was brief but pointed. She was quite excited about having an expert assessment of several pieces. Mr. Pratt inclined his head with professional courtesy, though Miss Marple detected a slight tightening around his eyes. "Mrs. Ashworth had contacted me regarding a Georgian silver service and some family portraits she believed might have historical significance. We had arranged to discuss them privately after the fete concluded." It was then that Inspector Craddock's attention focused on the mantelpiece with its pale rectangular outline in the dust. "There appears to be something missing from here. A photograph, perhaps." The effect of this observation was immediate and telling. Sarah's intake of breath was audible. Dr. Hawthorne's professional composure showed a hairline crack, and Mr. Pratt's carefully maintained neutrality required visible effort to sustain. "Uncle Harold's portrait," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying a note of genuine distress. "It was always there. Aunt Cordelia would never have moved it voluntarily. She said it was the finest likeness ever taken of him." Mr. Pratt cleared his throat with delicate precision. "If I may clarify, Inspector, Mrs. Ashworth had mentioned a valuable miniature portrait that usually occupied that position, a family heirloom of considerable worth, both sentimental and monetary." Timothy Fletcher, who had been hovering protectively near Sarah, stepped forward with unusual heat. "Surely you're not suggesting theft, Inspector? Mrs. Ashworth was beloved in this village. The idea that someone would take advantage of her hospitality to steal from her is unthinkable." But even as Timothy spoke these words of defense, Miss Marple observed how his eyes darted nervously toward the writing desk with its partially opened drawer. The young man's protective instincts were admirable. Yet there was an underlying anxiety in his manner that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances. Inspector Craddock's response was measured but firm. "Mr. Fletcher, I appreciate your loyalty to Mrs. Ashworth's memory, but it's my responsibility to examine all possibilities. The missing portrait, combined with other factors, suggests this matter requires thorough investigation." Miss Marple used this moment of heightened attention to drift closer to the French doors, ostensibly to admire the garden's late afternoon beauty. Her sharp eyes confirmed what she had suspected earlier. The nearly invisible fishing line was indeed present, caught on the elm's rough bark and leading in a path that would connect with the mysterious rocking chair. The mechanism was ingenious in its simplicity, designed to create the illusion of supernatural movement while concealing a very human manipulation. Dr. Hawthorne checked his pocket watch for the third time in as many minutes, his medical authority beginning to show signs of defensive brittleness. "Inspector, while I understand the need for thoroughness, I must emphasize that Mrs. Ashworth's death presents no obvious signs of violence. The missing portrait, while concerning, need not indicate anything more sinister than an opportunistic theft that unfortunately coincided with a natural death." The atmosphere in the room had shifted unmistakably from grief to suspicion, and Miss Marple reflected on how quickly the veneer of village respectability could crack under official scrutiny. Each person present was revealing small inconsistencies in their behavior, tiny fissures that suggested hidden knowledge or carefully guarded secrets. Mr. Pratt maintained his position near the fireplace, which Miss Marple noted allowed him to observe both the inspector's reactions and the behavior of the other witnesses. His sharp features revealed nothing, yet there was something in his watchful stillness that suggested the patience of someone accustomed to evaluating valuable objects and the people who possessed them. As Inspector Craddock announced his intention to conduct formal interviews with each witness, the reactions were as varied as they were revealing. Timothy's protective stance toward Sarah intensified. Dr. Hawthorne's professional demeanor required increasing effort to maintain, and Mr. Pratt's composed facade seemed to demand careful attention to sustain. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the French doors at a sharper angle, casting longer shadows across the sitting room and highlighting the dust motes that danced in the still air. Mrs. Ashworth remained in her peaceful repose, but the room around her had become charged with tension and unspoken accusations. Miss Marple knew from long experience that in such circumstances the truth often emerged not from dramatic confrontations but from the careful observation of human nature under stress. The missing portrait provided a convenient explanation for those seeking simple answers, but she suspected it was merely another thread in a web of deception far more complex than mere theft. The chair that rocked alone had begun to reveal its secrets, and she was certain that before the investigation concluded, several more carefully hidden truths would be brought into the unforgiving light of scrutiny. The village's peaceful facade was cracking, and through those cracks, Miss Marple could glimpse the shadows of secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. Inspector Craddock's approach to the individual interviews revealed both his professional competence and his intuitive understanding that in village mysteries, the most revealing information often emerged not from direct questioning but from the careful observation of how people reacted to each other's answers. He arranged to conduct the interviews in the morning room, but kept the door ajar so that the assembled witnesses remained within earshot, a strategy that Miss Marple recognized and quietly applauded. Dr. Hawthorne submitted to questioning first, his medical authority providing a natural starting point. His responses carried the measured precision of professional training, yet Miss Marple detected subtle variations in his tone that suggested carefully rehearsed explanations. When Inspector Craddock inquired about Mrs. Ashworth's recent health, the doctor spoke of minor heart concerns and a tonic he had prescribed, adding perhaps too emphatically that sudden cardiac failure would be entirely plausible at her age. Mrs. Ashworth had been experiencing some anxiety lately, Dr. Hawthorne explained, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that might have been professional composure or nervous tension. Nothing serious medically, but she had mentioned concerns about maintaining the property and managing her late husband's collection. I had advised reducing stress, though she was determined to host today's fete successfully. Miss Marple noted how the doctor avoided looking directly at the teacup with its telltale vermilion lipstick mark, and how his eyes seemed drawn repeatedly to the writing desk, with its partially opened drawer. When Craddock asked casually whether he had used the rocking chair earlier, Dr. Hawthorne admitted to resting there briefly while waiting for Mrs. Ashworth, a detail that placed him in perfect position to have arranged the fishing line mechanism. Timothy Fletcher's interview proved far more revealing than his protective devotion to Sarah might have suggested. Under Inspector Craddock's patient questioning, the young man's defensive loyalty began to crack, revealing underlying tensions that cast his earlier behavior in a different light. Mrs. Ashworth felt that Sarah deserved better prospects than I could provide, Timothy admitted with wounded pride. She had been quite vocal about her belief that village life would prove limiting for someone of Sarah's intelligence and background. She mentioned several times that London offered more suitable opportunities. This revelation caused Sarah to flinch visibly from her position on the terrace, and Miss Marple observed how the young woman's grief became complicated by the uncomfortable exposure of family disapproval that had remained hidden beneath village politeness. Timothy's passionate defense of Mrs. Ashworth's character now seemed motivated by more complex emotions than simple respect for the deceased. Mr. Poole, Pratt's interview demonstrated the composed professionalism of someone accustomed to official scrutiny regarding valuable objects. His responses were precisely measured, revealing expertise without betraying personal investment in the outcome. The miniature Mrs. Ashworth described was indeed valuable, he explained with detached authority. A Richard Cosway portrait of considerable historical and monetary worth. Mrs. Ashworth was quite knowledgeable about her possessions and had inquired about current market values for several pieces. Many elderly people find themselves needing to make practical decisions about family heirlooms when maintenance costs exceed available income. While the interviews continued, Miss Marple excused herself to assist with fresh tea, finding her way to Mrs. Brady's Ashworth's immaculate kitchen with the purposeful efficiency of someone genuinely helpful. Her domestic eye immediately noted telling details that others might overlook. The lemon dish showed no wet ring upon the marble surface, despite being prepared for service. Yet the sugar bowl displayed damp clumping around the spoon, and the spoon itself retained a slight stickiness as if hastily wiped clean. More significantly, on the dresser stood a small brown bottle labeled Heart Drops, its cork set carelessly beside it, leaving a faint ring on the polished wood. The bottle's placement suggested recent use, yet Mrs. Ashworth's precise nature would never have tolerated such casual treatment of her furniture. Miss Marple lifted the sugar spoon with delicate fingers, noting its condition before replacing it exactly as she had found it. Sarah entered the kitchen as Miss Marple arranged the tea service, her composure shadowed but controlled. At Miss Marple's gentle inquiry about her aunt's preferences, Sarah confirmed that Mrs. Ashworth took her tea with lemon and never sugar. Not since Uncle Harold's doctor scolded us all about our habits. Aunt said sugar stuck in one's middle like deceit. This domestic detail struck Miss Marple as particularly significant, especially when combined with the evidence of recent sugar use in the carelessly placed Heart Drops bottle. In her long experience, people often betrayed themselves through small departures from established habits, and the kitchen told a story of someone who had acted hastily under stress. Returning to the sitting room with the tea tray, Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe the reactions as Inspector Craddock announced his intention to examine Mrs. Ashworth's private papers. The effect was immediate and telling. Dr. Hawthorne cleared his throat with professional objection. Timothy's protective instincts towards Sarah intensified, and most significantly, Sarah's hands clenched involuntarily as her eyes darted toward the writing desk. "Inspector, surely Mrs. Ashworth's privacy deserves consideration," Dr. Hawthorne protested with medical authority. "If her death was natural, as I believe it to be, then disturbing her personal correspondence seems unnecessarily intrusive." But Inspector Craddock remained firm in his intention, and as he moved toward the writing desk, Miss Marple noted how the afternoon shadows had lengthened considerably, casting the sitting room in a different light that seemed to emphasize the wrongness she'd sensed from the beginning. The missing portrait provided a convenient focus for suspicion, yet she suspected it was merely another element in a more complex deception. Through the French doors, the green rocking chair sat motionless in the fading light, its mysterious earlier movement now explained by the nearly invisible fishing line she had detected. The mechanism was ingenious in its simplicity, designed to create a momentary distraction that would focus attention outward while more significant actions occurred within the house itself. As Inspector Craddock began his examination of the desk's contents, Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of the evidence before them. The obvious theft of the valuable portrait, the convenient presence of an antiques expert, and the natural explanation of heart failure all provided comfortable theories for those seeking simple answers. Yet the careful observer would note that the most telling clues lay not in dramatic gestures but in the small inconsistencies of domestic routine. A sugar spoon used by someone who never took sugar, heart drops left carelessly on polished wood, and a teacup positioned with deliberate precision. The chair that rocked alone had revealed one of its secrets through clever mechanical trickery, but Miss Marple was certain that the most dangerous truths remained hidden in the shadows of village respectability, waiting to be exposed by the careful examination of human nature under stress. The investigation was reaching a critical juncture where maintained deceptions would either hold firm or crumble under the weight of accumulated evidence, and Miss Marple suspected that Mrs. Ashworth's private papers would provide the key to understanding which of her guests had possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to turn a peaceful afternoon into a carefully orchestrated tragedy. Inspector Craddock's examination of the writing desk proceeded with the methodical care of someone accustomed to extracting truth from the detritus of daily life. The partially opened drawer revealed Mrs. Ashworth's characteristic precision. Bills arranged by date, correspondence filed according to importance, and a small leather-bound address book with entries in her careful copper-plate hand. Yet even in this orderly collection, Miss Marple noted subtle signs of recent disturbance, as if someone had searched through the papers with less reverence for Mrs. Ashworth's systematic nature. The first significant discovery came in the form of several letters from London dealers, their expensive letterheads suggesting the sort of establishments that catered to discerning collectors. Inspector Craddock read portions aloud with careful neutrality, revealing that Mrs. Ashworth had been making inquiries about the current market value of her late husband's collection, with particular emphasis on the Causeway miniature and the Georgian silver service. The correspondence suggested a woman exploring her options rather than one in immediate financial distress, yet the very existence of such inquiries cast her recent behavior in a different light. Mr. Pratt maintained his composed demeanor as these details emerged, though Miss Marple observed how his sharp features betrayed no surprise at the revelation of Mrs. Ashworth's commercial interests. "Many collectors find themselves curious about values," he observed with professional detachment. "Mrs. Ashworth struck me as a woman who preferred to make informed decisions about her possessions." More intriguing was a draft letter in Mrs. Ashworth's own hand, apparently intended for her solicitor, but never completed. The unfinished correspondence mentioned certain irregularities that require investigation, and a reference to protecting Sarah's inheritance from those who would exploit trust for personal gain. The letter's incomplete nature suggested it had been interrupted, perhaps by the very events that led to her death. Sarah's reaction to this revelation was particularly telling, her grief complicated by confusion about matters her aunt had clearly chosen not to discuss with her. "Aunt Cordelia never mentioned any concerns about irregularities," she said, her voice carrying a note of hurt alongside bewilderment. "She always said the collection would remain in the family, that it represented Uncle Harold's legacy." Timothy Fletcher's protective instincts toward Sarah intensified, though Miss Marple noted an underlying tension in his manner that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances. "Mrs. Ashworth was sometimes given to seeing complications where none existed," he said with forced lightness. "Perhaps these concerns were more imagined than real." Dr. Hawthorne moved closer to the desk, his medical authority lending weight to his observations. "Inspector, elderly patients sometimes develop anxieties about financial security, particularly when living alone with valuable possessions. These letters may simply reflect natural concerns rather than any actual wrongdoing." But Inspector Craddock's attention had been caught by the blotting pad beside the inkstand, its surface bearing the faint impressions of recent correspondence. With the practiced skill of someone accustomed to extracting information from reluctant sources, he held the pad to the light, revealing ghostly mirror images of Mrs. Ashworth's careful script. Miss Marple, appearing to adjust her knitting basket, positioned herself where she could observe the faint words that emerged. "Pratt credentials questionable," and below it, "Timothy bank accounts inconsistent salary." The effect of these revelations was immediate and profound. Mr. Pratt's professional composure required visible effort to maintain, while Timothy's face flushed with what appeared to be a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. Sarah looked between them with growing confusion, her understanding of recent events shifting as each new detail emerged. In the fireplace, where no fire had burned on such a warm afternoon, Inspector Craddock discovered the remnants of recently burned paper. Using a letter opener with delicate precision, he extracted several charred fragments, one of which bore the partially legible word codicil along its scorched edge. The implications were unmistakable. Someone had attempted to destroy evidence of Mrs. Ashworth's legal intentions. "Most irregular," Miss Marple murmured, her knitting needles clicking with gentle rhythm. "I recall a similar situation with old Mr. Weatherby, who discovered someone had been tampering with his papers. Such a relief when the truth finally emerged, though not pleasant for those involved." Dr. Hawthorne cleared his throat with medical authority, though his professional composure showed increasing strain. "Surely the destruction of papers doesn't necessarily indicate wrongdoing, Inspector. Mrs. Ashworth may have simply decided against whatever changes she was considering." But Inspector Craddock's systematic search had uncovered one more significant detail. Mrs. Ashworth's reticule was nowhere to be found. Sarah confirmed that her aunt never moved about the house without it, particularly when entertaining guests, as it contained not only her personal items, but also the key to the desk drawer where she kept her most valuable pieces secure. Miss Marple's sharp eyes had been drawn to something else entirely, as she bent to retrieve what appeared to be a dropped stitch. Her fingers closed around a small object that had lodged beneath the writing desk, a fragment of blue velvet with a torn green ribbon still attached. The material was of excellent quality, consistent with the sort of case that might house a valuable miniature portrait. "How curious," she observed mildly, examining the scrap with the interest of someone genuinely puzzled by household mysteries. "This appears to be from a jewelry case or similar container. I wonder how it came to be here, particularly in such a damaged condition." The discovery of the velvet fragment, combined with the missing reticule and the burned codicil, began to paint a picture of events far more complex than simple theft or natural death. Someone had not only taken the valuable miniature, but had also attempted to destroy evidence of Mrs. Ashworth's legal intentions, suggesting a crime motivated by more than mere financial gain. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the formal investigation prepared to enter its next phase, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating evidence before them. The obvious explanations of heart failure or opportunistic theft were giving way to something far more sinister, a carefully planned deception that had transformed a peaceful village fete into the stage for murder. The missing reticule suggested that Mrs. Ashworth's killer had needed access to something she kept secure, while the burned codicil indicated an attempt to prevent legal changes that someone found threatening. Through the French doors, the green rocking chair sat motionless in the fading light, its mysterious earlier movement now explained by the nearly invisible fishing line that had served its purpose as a distraction. Yet Miss Marple suspected that this mechanical trickery was merely one element in a more elaborate deception, designed to focus attention away from the real crime occurring within the house itself. The chair that rocked alone had revealed some of its secrets, but the most dangerous truths remained hidden beneath the surface of village respectability, waiting to be exposed by the careful examination of human nature under the pressure of official scrutiny. Mrs. Ashworth's methodical investigation of her associates had apparently brought her close to uncovering something that someone had been willing to kill to protect, and Miss Marple was determined to complete what the deceased woman had begun. Inspector Craddock's decision to conduct a thorough search of personal effects transformed the atmosphere from tense cooperation to barely concealed apprehension. The systematic nature of his approach left no room for the comfortable assumptions that had sustained the afternoon's earlier conversations, and Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction how each individual's composure required increasingly visible effort to maintain. The first significant discovery came when Constable Polk returned from the hall carrying Mr. Pratt's leather attaché case. The antiques expert maintained his professional demeanor as the inspector opened it methodically, revealing the expected array of valuation tools: calipers, jeweler's loupe, small scales, and folded cloth. Yet beneath these implements lay something that caused the assembled company to draw a collective breath of surprise. The blue velvet case bore an unmistakably torn green ribbon, its frayed edges matching precisely the fragment Miss Marple had discovered beneath the writing desk. When Inspector Craddock opened it with careful precision, the oval impression in the padded lining told its own story of recent occupancy, though the miniature itself was conspicuously absent. Mr. Pratt's reaction was immediate and controlled. "That case is not mine, Inspector. I carry professional instruments, not velvet containers for stolen goods. Any thief could have placed it among my belongings during the confusion following Mrs. Ashworth's death. The hall has been a thoroughfare all afternoon." Miss Marple stepped forward with gentle courtesy, producing the velvet fragment from her reticule. "How curious that this piece should match so exactly, Mr. Pratt. The ribbon appears to have been torn in half, creating quite a distinctive pattern." Her mild observation carried the weight of irrefutable evidence, and she noted how Timothy Fletcher's relief at this development seemed disproportionate to mere satisfaction at seeing justice served. The search of the premises yielded another crucial discovery, when Constable Polk emerged from the scullery carrying Mrs. Ashworth's missing reticule. Found beneath vegetable peelings and paper waste, it had been thoroughly emptied of its contents, though the keyring remained. Most significantly, the smallest key was missing, the one that would fit the locked compartment of the writing desk where Mrs. Ashworth kept her most valuable documents secure. "Not the work of an outside thief," Miss Marple observed with apologetic mildness. "An intruder would have taken all the keys, not selected the specific one needed for the desk compartment." It was then that Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, spoke up with the hesitant courage of someone who had been wrestling with the significance of her observations. "Inspector, I hope this isn't presumptuous, but Mrs. Ashworth seemed quite distressed earlier today. She was searching frantically for something she described as absolutely crucial, something that would set everything straight." Inspector Craddock's attention sharpened immediately. "What was she looking for, Mrs. Clement?" "A small velvet-bound diary, Inspector. She said it contained information that someone needed to see before it was too late. She appeared genuinely frightened that she couldn't locate it." Mrs. Clement's voice grew stronger as she recognized the importance of her testimony. She mentioned that certain people weren't what they seemed, and that she had been documenting her concerns. This revelation cast the entire investigation in a different light. The missing miniature and the burned codicil suddenly seemed like carefully orchestrated distractions, designed to focus attention on obvious motives while concealing a deeper, more dangerous secret. Miss Marple reflected on how the velvet fragment might have come from the diary's binding rather than the miniature's case, suggesting that Mrs. Ashworth's killer had been searching for something far more incriminating than valuable objects. As the implications of the missing diary settled over the assembled company, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a detail that had been nagging at her observational instincts throughout the afternoon. The vermilion lipstick mark on Mrs. Ashworth's teacup showed a subtle but telling smudge, as if a second mouth had tested the rim before the cup reached its intended recipient. In her long experience with village tragedies, such small inconsistencies often revealed the most crucial truths about method and opportunity. Dr. Best Hawthorne's increasing discomfort became more pronounced as each piece of evidence emerged, his medical authority providing insufficient shield against the accumulating implications. Timothy Fletcher's reactions continued to suggest relief at developments that implicated others, while Sarah's confusion deepened as she realized her aunt had been living in fear of people she had welcomed into her home. The afternoon shadows had lengthened considerably, casting the sitting room in the sort of golden light that emphasized dust motes and hidden details. Mrs. Ashworth remained in her peaceful repose, but the room around her had become charged with the electricity of approaching revelation. Miss Marple sensed that they were approaching the critical moment when carefully maintained deceptions would either hold firm or crumble under the weight of accumulated evidence. The chair that rocked alone had served its purpose as a mechanical distraction, But now the real investigation was revealing the human machinery of deception that had transformed a peaceful village fete into the stage for murder. Mrs. Ashworth's methodical documentation of her suspicions had apparently brought her dangerously close to exposing secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect, and Miss Marple was determined to complete what the deceased woman had begun. The missing diary represented more than evidence. It was the key to understanding why Mrs. Ashworth had died, and Miss Marple suspected that its contents would reveal motivations far more complex than simple greed or inheritance disputes. The tension in Mrs. Ashworth's sitting room had crystallized into something almost tangible, each revelation adding weight to an atmosphere already heavy with unspoken accusations and carefully guarded secrets. Inspector Craddock's methodical approach had begun to strip away the comfortable assumptions that had sustained the afternoon's earlier conversations, and Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction how each individual's composure required increasingly visible effort to maintain. It was then that Miss Marple made an observation that would prove crucial to unraveling the entire deception. Rising from her chair with the gentle determination of someone who had reached an unavoidable conclusion, she approached the teacup on the side table with the focused attention she usually reserved for a particularly complex knitting pattern. "Inspector," she said mildly, examining the delicate Derby china with its unmistakable vermilion lipstick mark, "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity about domestic details. Mrs. Ashworth was so particular about her habits, you see. Sarah, dear, your aunt never took sugar in her tea, did she?" Sarah shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "Never, Miss Marple. She said sugar disagreed with her digestion, and she was most fastidious about not smudging her lipstick when drinking." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her pale blue eyes noting the subtle but telling smudge on the cup's rim, as if a second mouth had tested it before reaching its intended recipient. "Yet here we have evidence of sugar use, and this slight smudge suggests the cup was handled by someone less careful about such feminine details." Her gaze moved to the kitchen doorway. The sugar spoon shows recent use, with damp crystals still clinging to its surface, and the Heart Drops bottle was left carelessly on polished wood, creating a ring that Mrs. Ashworth would never have tolerated. Dr. Hawthorne's reaction was immediate and defensive. "Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting that domestic irregularities indicate anything more sinister than the natural confusion following a medical emergency. Mrs. Ashworth may simply have been feeling unwell and departed from her usual habits." But Miss Marple's attention had been drawn to something else entirely. Through the French doors, the green rocking chair sat motionless in the lengthening shadows, and her observant eye had detected what others had missed: the faint outline of a rectangular panel in the chair's wooden base, barely visible unless one knew exactly where to look. "How curious," she murmured, moving toward the terrace with the unhurried pace of someone following a compelling thread of logic. Mrs. Ashworth mentioned that this chair had belonged to her late husband, who spent many peaceful hours here. "Old furniture often contains the most ingenious hiding places, don't you think, Inspector?" Her examination of the chair revealed what her sharp eyes had suspected. The seat cushion concealed a shallow compartment, cunningly crafted and accessible only to someone who knew of its existence. When Inspector Craddock lifted the faded chintz cushion at her suggestion, his fingers met the resistance of a wooden panel that yielded to gentle pressure. There, nestled in the secret compartment where no casual observer would think to look, lay Mrs. Ashworth's missing diary. The small velvet-bound book was indeed blue as midnight, its green ribbon torn and frayed in a pattern that matched exactly the fragment Miss Marple had discovered earlier. The sight of this crucial evidence caused Sarah to gasp with recognition, while the assembled company stood frozen in a tableau of shock and dawning comprehension. Inspector Craddock opened the diary with careful precision, its pages revealing Mrs. Ashworth's methodical documentation of her growing suspicions. Her neat copperplate handwriting recorded observations that cast several of her guests in an entirely different light. OP credentials require independent verification. TF lifestyle inconsistent with stated income. And most damning of all, GH prescription dosages queried. Consult Dr. March regarding dangerous combinations. The effect of these revelations was immediate and profound. Mr. Pratt's professional composure required visible effort to maintain, his sharp features betraying a flash of genuine concern for the first time that afternoon. Timothy Fletcher's protective stance toward Sarah intensified, though there was an underlying nervousness in his manner that seemed disproportionate to mere worry for her well-being. Dr. Hawthorne's medical authority began to show hairline cracks, his earlier certainty about natural causes now sounding increasingly hollow. "She was documenting everything," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and horror. Aunt Cordelia always said that careful observation was the key to understanding people's true nature. Miss Marple noted with particular interest that several pages had been carefully removed from the diary, their absence evident from the tightness of the remaining binding. "Someone has been quite selective about which entries to preserve," she observed mildly. "The missing pages would likely have contained the most incriminating details." It was then that Inspector Craddock discovered the final piece of physical evidence that would prove crucial to understanding the afternoon's events. Hidden beneath the diary in the chair's compartment lay a small brass key, its surface bearing traces of a dark residue that carried the faint scent of lemon and something more medicinal. Timothy Fletcher's reaction to the discovery of this key was particularly telling, his hands moving instinctively to his jacket pockets as if checking for something that should have been there. "I helped Mrs. Ashworth with various tasks today," he said, his voice carrying a defensive note. "She often asked me to fetch things from her desk when her arthritis troubled her." Dr. Hawthorne stepped forward with renewed professional authority, though Miss Marple detected an underlying tension in his manner. "Inspector, I must protest this continued speculation about Mrs. Ashworth's death. Without proper medical examination, these domestic details prove nothing about the cause of her passing." But Miss Marple had been observing more than physical evidence. Her sharp eyes had catalogued the subtle changes in behavior, the nervous gestures, and the carefully guarded reactions that revealed far more than any formal testimony. The missing diary pages, the tampered teacup, and the suspicious placement of the heart drops all pointed to a crime of careful planning disguised as spontaneous tragedy. The chair served its purpose admirably. She reflected, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm, not only as a hiding place for dangerous secrets, but as the centerpiece of a very clever distraction. The fishing line mechanism was ingenious in its simplicity, designed to focus attention outward while more significant actions occurred within the house itself. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the formal investigation prepared to enter its final phase, Miss Marple sensed that they were approaching the moment when carefully maintained deceptions would either hold firm or crumble under the weight of accumulated evidence. The diary had revealed Mrs. Ashworth's methodical investigation of those around her, but the missing pages suggested that someone had been equally methodical in attempting to conceal their crimes. The chair that rocked alone had yielded its most precious secret, but Miss Marple suspected that the most dangerous truths were yet to be revealed. Mrs. Ashworth's death had been carefully orchestrated to appear natural, yet the evidence pointed unmistakably to murder, committed by someone who had gained her trust sufficiently to approach her tea service unobserved. The peaceful village fete had indeed become the stage for tragedy. But Miss Marple was determined to ensure that Mrs. Ashworth's methodical pursuit of truth would not have been in vain. The missing pages might be gone, but human nature under stress would provide the final clues necessary to expose the killer and complete what the deceased woman had begun. The discovery of Mrs. Ashworth's diary had transformed the investigation from a matter of theft and natural death into something far more sinister, and Miss Marple observed with the patient attention of long experience how each revelation stripped away another carefully maintained layer of village respectability. Inspector Craddock's methodical examination of the remaining entries revealed a woman who had been systematically documenting her growing concerns about those she had welcomed into her home with such generous trust. The most troubling entry, dated just 4 days prior, read in Mrs. Ashworth's careful copper plate: GH prescription dosages require urgent verification with Dr. March. Patient complaints suggest dangerous combinations deliberately prescribed. Mrs. Weatherby's symptoms before her passing now seem suspicious in retrospect. Below this, in darker ink that suggested a later addition made with trembling fingers, she had written, "Must document everything carefully. Trust has been betrayed in the most fundamental way." Dr. Hawthorne's reaction to these revelations was immediate and professionally defensive, though Miss Marple noted how his hands required conscious effort to remain steady. "Inspector, these are the confused anxieties of an elderly patient who had been experiencing considerable stress. Mrs. Ashworth's concerns about my practice were entirely unfounded, based on misunderstandings about modern pharmaceutical approaches and her tendency to discuss her neighbor's medical complaints inappropriately." His explanation carried the authority of medical training, yet there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested a man defending territory he knew to be vulnerable. Miss Marple had observed such behavior before in those whose professional competence masked more personal failings, and she noted how his gaze avoided the teacup with its telltale evidence of domestic irregularities. Timothy Fletcher's visible relief at seeing suspicion directed elsewhere did not escape her notice, though his protective concern for Sarah appeared genuine enough. Mr. Pratt maintained his composed demeanor, yet there was a subtle relaxation in his posture that suggested a man who had feared worse revelations than those contained in the diary's remaining pages. It was then that Miss Marple made the observation that would prove crucial to understanding the afternoon's tragic events. Rising from her chair with the gentle determination of someone following an inevitable thread of logic, she approached the side table where Mrs. Ashworth's teacup sat in its incriminating stillness. "Inspector," she said with apologetic mildness, "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity about domestic details. The teacup tells such an interesting story when one knows how to read it properly." Her pale blue eyes fixed on the delicate Derby china with its unmistakable vermilion lipstick mark. Mrs. Ashworth was most particular about her habits, you see. "Sarah, dear, your aunt never took sugar in her tea, did she?" Sarah shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "Never, Miss Marple. She said it disagreed with her digestion terribly, and Uncle Harold's doctor had been quite firm about avoiding it entirely." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as she considered the evidence before them. Yet the sugar spoon in the kitchen shows recent use, with damp crystals still clinging to its surface. Most curious for someone who never touched the substance. Her gaze moved to the brass key discovered with the diary. And this little key bears such interesting traces, doesn't it? Almost medicinal in nature, with just a hint of lemon. Dr. Hawthorne stepped forward with renewed professional authority, though Miss Marple detected an underlying tension that had not been present earlier in the afternoon. "Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting that domestic irregularities indicate anything more sinister than the natural confusion following a medical emergency? Mrs. Ashworth may simply have been feeling unwell and departed from her usual habits in her final moments." But Miss Marple's attention had been drawn to something else entirely, a detail that had been troubling her observational instincts throughout the investigation. The vermilion lipstick mark on the teacup showed a subtle but telling smudge, as if a second mouth had tested the rim before the cup reached its intended recipient. "How curious," she murmured, examining the evidence with the focused attention she usually reserved for particularly complex knitting patterns. "This slight irregularity in the lipstick suggests the cup was handled by someone less careful about such feminine details. Someone who might not have realized how precisely Mrs. Ashworth applied her cosmetics or how particular she was about not disturbing them while drinking." The effect of this observation was immediate and telling. Dr. Hawthorne's professional composure showed its first visible crack, a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested calculations being rapidly revised. Timothy Fletcher's nervous energy seemed to focus with relief on this new direction of inquiry, while Sarah looked between them with growing confusion about the implications of such seemingly innocent details. Inspector Craddock's systematic mind had been working through the timeline with methodical precision. "Dr. Hawthorne, you mentioned checking the kitchen for Mrs. Ashworth during the period when she was absent from the terrace. Did you have occasion to handle any items from her tea service during that time?" The doctor's response came with careful professional precision. "I may have moved a cup or saucer while looking for her, Inspector. The kitchen was being prepared for service, and I was concerned about her prolonged absence." Such domestic details seem hardly relevant to understanding her medical condition. Miss Marple's sharp eyes had noted something else that others might overlook. The heart drops bottle on the kitchen dresser, its cork set carelessly beside it in a way that left a faint ring on the polished wood. Mrs. Ashworth's precise nature would never have tolerated such casual treatment of her furniture, yet someone acting under stress might easily have made such an oversight. "The missing diary pages were removed quite deliberately," she observed with gentle persistence. "Notice how cleanly they were torn, Inspector. This wasn't the work of someone acting in panic, but rather the methodical destruction of specific evidence by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for." As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the formal investigation prepared to enter its final phase, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating evidence before them. The obvious explanations of heart failure or theft were giving way to something far more calculated. A carefully planned deception that had transformed a peaceful village fete into the stage for murder. Mrs. Ashworth's methodical investigation of those around her had apparently brought her dangerously close to exposing secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. The chair that rocked alone had served its purpose as both hiding place and distraction, but now its secrets were yielding to the patient examination of evidence and the careful observation of human behavior under the mounting pressure of official scrutiny. Dr. Hawthorne's increasing discomfort suggested a man whose carefully constructed professional facade was beginning to crumble under the weight of domestic details that revealed far more than any formal testimony. Miss Marple sensed they were approaching the moment when maintained deceptions would either hold firm or collapse entirely under the accumulated evidence. The killer had been clever in using Mrs. Ashworth's own medical condition and prescribed medications to disguise murder as natural death. But human nature under stress invariably revealed itself through small inconsistencies and telling oversights. The peaceful village gathering had indeed become the stage for tragedy, but Miss Marple was determined to ensure that Mrs. Ashworth's methodical pursuit of truth would not have been in vain. The missing pages might be gone, but the story they had told was written in the domestic details of sugar spoons and lipstick marks, in carelessly placed medicine bottles and keys that bore the residue of hasty crimes. Tomorrow would bring the final reckoning, and Miss Marple was confident that justice would prevail over the shadows of respectability that had provided cover for such calculated betrayal of trust. The accumulated weight of evidence had transformed the atmosphere in Mrs. Ashworth's sitting room into something charged with barely contained revelation. And Miss Marple sensed with the instinctive certainty of long experience that they had reached the critical moment when carefully maintained deceptions would either hold firm or crumble entirely under official scrutiny. Inspector Craddock's methodical examination had stripped away the comfortable assumptions that had sustained the investigation's earlier phases, and she could observe how each individual's composure now required increasingly visible effort to maintain. It was then that Miss Marple made her decisive move with the gentle precision that had served her so well in previous investigations. Rising from her chair with apologetic courtesy, she approached the French doors where the fishing line fragment still clung to the elm's rough bark, barely visible unless one knew exactly where to look. "Inspector," she said with mild curiosity, "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's fascination with domestic details." This transparent thread has been troubling me throughout the afternoon." She gestured toward the nearly invisible line with her knitting needle. "You see, it's been tied with such a particular knot, hasn't it? Not the simple bow that most people would use, but something far more precise and secure." Inspector Craddock examined the fishing line with renewed interest, his trained eye noting the neat, methodical construction of the knot that had secured it to the chair's mechanism. The binding was indeed distinctive, showing a level of precision that suggested professional training in the manipulation of delicate materials under pressure. "A surgeon's knot," Dr. Hawthorne said quietly, his voice carrying the automatic authority of medical knowledge before he seemed to realize the implications of his observation. The words hung in the air like an admission, and Miss Marple noted how his professional composure showed its first visible crack as he understood what he had inadvertently revealed. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her pale blue eyes meeting his with innocent directness. "How knowledgeable of you to recognize it so quickly, Doctor. I confess I wouldn't have known the difference myself, but you're quite right. It's exactly the sort of knot that someone with surgical training would tie instinctively, even when working with fishing line rather than sutures." The effect of this observation was immediate and profound. Timothy Fletcher's nervous energy seemed to focus with visible relief on this new direction of inquiry, while Sarah looked between them with growing confusion about the implications of such seemingly technical details. Mr. Pratt maintained his composed demeanor, yet there was a subtle relaxation in his posture that suggested a man who had feared far worse revelations than those emerging. Inspector Craddock's systematic mind had been working through the timeline with methodical precision. "Dr. Hawthorne, you mentioned earlier that you had occasion to sit in the rocking chair while waiting for Mrs. Ashworth. That would have provided an excellent opportunity to arrange such a mechanism, particularly for someone with the manual dexterity that surgical training provides." The doctor's response came with careful professional precision, though Miss Marple detected an underlying tension that had not been present earlier in the afternoon. "Inspector, I must protest this continued speculation based on such circumstantial evidence. The fact that I can identify a particular type of knot hardly constitutes proof of wrongdoing. Many people possess such knowledge without being criminals." But Miss Marple had been observing more than technical details throughout the investigation. Her sharp eyes had catalogued the subtle changes in behavior, the nervous gestures, and the carefully guarded reactions that revealed far more than any formal testimony. She had noted how Dr. Hawthorne's hands trembled slightly when he straightened his waistcoat, how his gaze consistently avoided the teacup with its telltale lipstick smudge, and most significantly, how his professional authority seemed to require increasing effort to maintain as each piece of evidence emerged. "The curious thing about the fishing line mechanism," she continued with gentle persistence, "is how perfectly it served its purpose as a distraction. Someone needed to ensure that attention was focused outward on the terrace, while more significant actions occurred within the house itself. The timing had to be precise, you see, to coordinate with the preparation of Mrs. Ashworth's final cup of tea." Sarah's reaction to this implication was immediate and distressing, her grief complicated by the dawning realization that her aunt's death had been carefully orchestrated by someone she had trusted completely. "You're suggesting that someone deliberately planned this while we were all enjoying the fete," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the afternoon breeze that stirred the curtains at the French doors. Inspector Craddock moved closer to the side table where Mrs. Ashworth's teacup sat in its incriminating stillness. "The evidence suggests a very specific method of administration that would have required medical knowledge to implement safely. The sugar spoon shows recent use despite Mrs. Ashworth's well-known aversion to sweetening her tea, and the brass key bears traces of both lemon and medicinal residue." Dr. Hawthorne's professional facade began to show hairline cracks as the accumulated evidence mounted against him. "Inspector, these domestic irregularities prove nothing definitive about Mrs. Ashworth's cause of death. Without proper laboratory analysis, such speculation is both premature and potentially damaging to reputations built over years of dedicated service to this community." Miss Marple approached the teacup with the focused attention she usually reserved for particularly complex knitting patterns. The vermilion lipstick mark tells such an interesting story when one knows how to read it properly, she observed mildly. Mrs. Ashworth was most particular about not smudging her cosmetics while drinking. Yet here we see clear evidence of a second mouth having tested the rim. Someone who understood her habits well enough to exploit them, but lacked the feminine attention to detail necessary to avoid leaving traces. The revelation struck home with devastating precision. Dr. Hawthorne's carefully maintained composure finally cracked entirely, his medical authority crumbling under the weight of domestic details that revealed far more than any professional testimony could conceal. His hands, which had remained steady throughout his examination of Mrs. Ashworth's body, now trembled visibly as he reached instinctively toward his medical bag before thinking better of the gesture. "The diary entries were quite specific about your prescriptions, Doctor," Miss Marple continued with relentless gentleness. Mrs. Ashworth had been documenting her concerns about dangerous combinations deliberately prescribed, particularly in cases where the results would appear natural to casual observation. Mrs. Weatherby's death, which seemed so routine at the time, apparently began to trouble her when she noticed patterns in your patient care. Inspector Craddock's voice carried the quiet authority of official conclusion. "Dr. Geoffrey Hawthorne, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth. The evidence suggests you used your medical knowledge and her trust in your professional care to administer a fatal combination of her prescribed heart medication with substances that would accelerate its effects while maintaining the appearance of natural death." The confession, when it came, emerged not as dramatic admission, but as the quiet collapse of a man whose carefully constructed deception had been systematically dismantled by patient observation and methodical investigation. Dr. Hawthorne's shoulders sagged as the weight of exposure settled upon him, his professional reputation crumbling along with his freedom. As Constable Polk stepped forward with handcuffs, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic nature of betrayed trust in small communities. The peaceful village fete had indeed become the stage for murder, but the methodical examination of human behavior under stress had revealed the truth that Mrs. Ashworth had died pursuing. The chair that rocked alone had served its purpose as both hiding place and distraction. But ultimately it was the careful observation of domestic inconsistencies and professional habits that had exposed the killer and completed what the deceased woman had begun with her courageous investigation of those who had betrayed her trust so completely. The mystery was solved, but Miss Marple knew that the village would carry the scars of this revelation for years to come, a reminder that the greatest dangers often came disguised as the most trusted forms of care and professional duty. The evening shadows had settled over St. Mary Mead with the gentle finality of a curtain falling on a tragic performance, and Miss Marple remained in Mrs. Ashworth's sitting room long after Inspector Craddock had departed with his prisoner and the assembled company had dispersed to process the afternoon's shocking revelations. The quiet click of handcuffs around Dr. Hawthorne's wrists had reverberated through the room like a death knell for the village's innocence, marking the end of an elaborate deception that had cost at least one life and shattered the trust that formed the foundation of rural community life. The confession, when it finally emerged in the privacy of official questioning, revealed a web of calculated murder far more extensive than even Miss Marple had initially suspected. Dr. Hawthorne's carefully constructed reputation had concealed years of systematic exploitation, using his medical authority to accelerate the deaths of wealthy elderly patients whose estates could be influenced through selective treatment and carefully timed interventions. Mrs. Ashworth's methodical investigation had brought her dangerously close to exposing what could only be described as medical murder disguised as the natural progression of age and infirmity. The mechanism of her death, as the doctor eventually admitted, had been diabolically simple in its exploitation of routine and trust. Knowing her precise habits regarding tea service and her prescribed heart medication, He had prepared a fatal combination using the sugar she never touched, dissolving a concentrated dose of her own heart drops along with a complementary substance that would ensure rapid absorption and accelerated cardiac failure. The fishing line contraption had been arranged during his earlier visit to the rocking chair, timed to create the crucial distraction that would focus attention outward while he completed his deadly preparation in the kitchen, exploiting his intimate knowledge of her domestic routines and medical vulnerabilities. Sarah's world had been irrevocably altered by these revelations, her grief complicated by the terrible realization that her aunt's final weeks had been shadowed by fear of someone she had trusted with her very life. The missing diary pages, as Dr. Hawthorne confessed, had contained detailed documentation of suspicious prescriptions and the patterns Mrs. Ashworth had detected in other village deaths, particularly Mrs. Weatherby's passing, which had initially seemed so natural and routine. His desperate search for these incriminating records had led him to arrange the private meeting under the guise of discussing her valuable collection, never suspecting that she had hidden her most dangerous discoveries in the secret compartment of her late husband's favorite chair. Timothy Fletcher's nervous behavior throughout the investigation had stemmed from entirely different concerns, as subsequent inquiries revealed. His modest financial irregularities involved nothing more serious than an unauthorized loan to purchase Sarah's engagement ring, a romantic gesture that had caused him considerable professional anxiety but posed no threat to anyone's safety. Mrs. Ashworth's disapproval of the match had been based on her belief that Sarah deserved broader opportunities than village life could provide, not on any suspicion of criminal activity, though her methodical nature had led her to document even these minor inconsistencies. Mr. Pratt departed St. Mary Mead the following morning, his research on local artifacts abruptly concluded and his reputation cleared of any criminal association. The miniature portrait, ironically, had never been stolen at all, and the velvet case found among his belongings had indeed been planted during the confusion following the discovery of Mrs. Ashworth's body. His presence had been entirely legitimate, though his sharp eye for valuable objects had made him a convenient suspect in Dr. Hawthorne's desperate attempt to create multiple theories and confuse the investigation. The investigation into Dr. Hawthorne's other patients would continue for months, revealing a systematic campaign of medical murder that had enriched him through carefully timed inheritance manipulations and estate planning advice offered to grieving families. The very trust that patients placed in medical authority had become the weapon he used against them, exploiting the natural assumption that elderly people died of natural causes to conceal his calculated interventions. As autumn settled over St. Mary Mead, the green rocking chair remained on Mrs. Ashworth's terrace. Though Sarah found its presence too painful to bear and eventually decided to sell the cottage and return to London, Timothy followed her to the city, his devotion proving stronger than his attachment to rural banking, and their engagement provided one bright note in the aftermath of such calculated betrayal. The chair that had rocked alone would serve as a silent testament to courage and deception, its mysterious movement now explained, but its symbolic significance forever altered by the tragedy it had witnessed. Miss Marple returned to her own cottage with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had helped complete Mrs. Ashworth's courageous investigation, though she knew the village would carry the scars of this revelation for years to come. The peaceful facade of rural life had been permanently altered by the discovery that the greatest dangers could come disguised as the most trusted forms of professional care, and that careful observation of human nature remained the most reliable defense against those who would exploit the very relationships designed to provide security and comfort. The mystery was solved, the killer exposed and confined, but Miss Marple understood that the true tragedy lay not in the crime itself, but in the shattering of trust that would forever change how the community viewed the delicate balance between professional authority and personal vulnerability. Mrs. Ashworth's legacy would live on in the reminder that vigilance and methodical observation could triumph over even the most sophisticated deceptions, though the price of such victory was always higher than anyone should have to pay. The chair that rocked alone had told its story completely. revealing not just the mechanics of murder, but the eternal truth that in the careful observation of human nature lay both the greatest dangers and the most reliable path to justice.